Thank you very much, and welcome you all to this last session of the two-day conference. So we have had 8 sessions already, including the inaugural session, and we have come to the 9th one, which is about the future of cross-border education towards inclusivity and sustainability. So at this point, we have been discussing so many things about cross-border education in the last 2 days, starting basically with the diagnosis of the inequality or the asymmetry or imbalance that exists between the global south and global north. And that has been the crux of this particular conference. We have been discussing about it. And after that diagnosis, we come to dissect. In some of them, we have also tried to dissect it further, whether this imbalance, how is this direction, and also what is the problem with this, why this imbalance exists. And so many papers have been discussed in last 2 days. And then to continue and close this particular conference is the last session where we are trying to see the next direction for cross-border education. It was very interesting. The previous session went very, very well with lots of questions raised and almost there to question and also engage with the future of cross-border education. So thank you very much to all those who were in the previous session who discussed about virtual student mobility and many, many more things. And that was very interesting. So even before I go ahead with this particular panel discussion, I would like to introduce all my panel members. May I request all of you to switch on your cameras, keep your cameras switched on so that the engagement can remain more lively and more dynamic. I request all of you. I think Dr. Vijay Khare and Dr. Fiona Hunter have already switched on their cameras. I request the others also. I see them, yeah. So I see, so to introduce the panel, I start with Bowen Xu. Bowen Xu is a doctoral researcher at Cambridge University, focusing on China's Belt and Road Initiative with its implications for regional political economy and higher education. He explores education policy, international relations, Asian regionalism, new geopolitics, and knowledge production. Welcome, Bowen, to the panel discussion. And next we have is César de Prado. Dr. Prado is a MOFA fellow at the EU Center in Taiwan, Department of Political Science of National Taiwan University, relaunching his academic career with several articles on Europe, China, Asia, and he also has a book on EU Plus in Great Power Competition. He has published 3 books, including Global Multi-Level Governance, European and East Asian Leadership through the United Nations University Press. And he has single-authored around 40 novel academic articles, book chapters, and policy papers. So thank you very much for joining, Dr. Prado. Next is Dr. Fiona Hunter. She works globally as a consultant, trainer, and researcher in higher education with private, public, and faith-based institutions. She's also Associate Director at the Center for Higher Education Internationalization at the Università Cattolica del Sacro, Cuore in Milan, Italy, and co-editor of the Journal of Studies for International Education. Her work focuses mainly on strategic change and internationalization, and recent projects have included work with university leadership in Italy, Romania, Albania, Russia, Israel, Colombia, and Cuba. Extensively worked in different parts of the world. Dr. Vijay Khare, somebody who's a friend of Manipal and has participated earlier in the conference too. He's a senior professor and head Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Savitribai Phule, Pune University, Pune. He was awarded partial fellowship by the United Nations University, Tokyo, Japan. Dr. Khare was selected for United Nations short course on hologrammatic terrorism, Inter-Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute, University of Rome, Italy, and many more. He completed an executive leadership program and advanced mediation and peacemaking program at the University of London, UK. So this is the panel, and I'm really, really excited to find out what do they think is the future of cross-border education. So I would like to, I have already written to them earlier, so if we can have this particular discussion in maybe around 3 rounds, and then open the panel to questions from our other panelists and also those who are attending this particular conference. So there are two, three things that we need to attend to in the next 1.5 hours. And one of them to begin with is the idea of inclusivity in cross-border education. Of course, we have been discussing about how inclusive it has been, but in the changing scenario, particularly after COVID-19, with changes that are driving us a little away from supposedly what we can now call as a traditional mobility towards a virtual mobility. So we discussed in quite a few sessions earlier how the mobility has not been very inclusive, and how international education has remained quite elitist, with maybe only 1% of student population having access to international mobility worldwide. So may I just invite, maybe I can begin with Dr. Prado, if I can call you César, if you would like to start this particular round. What do you think about inclusivity in cross-border education? Is it there to begin with, and where does the future stand? Even if we move from the traditional mobility, see, I'm calling it a traditional mobility, something that was there very much with the emergence of virtual student mobility. So is it there, or where is it missing, if at all it is?
Okay, great, thank you. Well, namaste to India again, and hello to the whole world. And thank you for having me here again today, and for letting me speak first. I thought Professor Dr. Shu would be first, but I'm happy to be the first one. Inclusivity, you just recall, is extremely low, 1-2%. Somebody in a previous session said only 2% of people have some international cross-border experience. So that's not inclusive at all from a general perspective. Having said that, in Europe, there is a number of cross-border movements that point towards the direction of inclusivity. That the direction, it's a very long way goal, but the direction is what Europe is heading to, with 2 complementary mechanisms: the Erasmus program managed by the European Commission, that's Brussels, European Union institutions, and the Bologna process, which is technically outside of the European Union, even though the European Union is perhaps the most active member within the Bologna process to create a European higher education area. So the Erasmus program is well known. Probably in India, you know the global aspect of it, but in Europe is different, because millions of people have been moving in the past few years. It started in the late 80s with hundreds or just a few thousands of students, but it picked up speed over the years, and in the past few years, millions of students and faculty have profited from different opportunities to study abroad for 1 or 2 semesters. The students, faculty study for short cross borders for shorter periods. And there is more money for the next 7-year period of Erasmus Plus, that's what's called. And it's inclusive also in the sense that it's open up to other young people and their interests. So youths that are not studying at university level, young people playing sports, etc. So in that sense, it's becoming more inclusive. Just focusing on the higher education level, there is a new mechanism that has been created also a bit technically outside of the Erasmus Plus funding, but very much profiting from it. It's called the Erasmus University Network. It was created just in the past 2 or 3 years. It was proposed by France. Many of the European Union and European cooperation mechanisms are proposed by France in education and other fields, and not by the UK, which is now outside of the European Union. Cross-border education has a number of venues, a number of mechanisms now that students can profit from in order to study for 1 semester, 2 semester, summer schools, full degree programs. Costs are relatively low in most European countries. Transportation and communication is very affordable in Europe. COVID pandemic is now finishing in most countries in Europe. So mobility, not only virtual, but blended and full physical mobility will soon now, or very soon, next semester, pick up again in Europe. So I think the positive trend is clear in Europe. But when we move out to other parts of the world, I study East Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. There's a number of programs and mechanisms trying to promote cross-border cooperation among basically elite students. They're not very inclusive. I mean, it's very clear. It's just is focusing on the elites. For instance, China, South Korea, and Japan have had for about a decade a program called Campus Asia, and the students have to know 3 languages: Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. So it's almost impossible that a normal average Chinese, Korean, or Japanese student can manage that. So it's extremely elitist. In ASEAN, Southeast Asia is also very difficult for a number of reasons. And in South Asia, now, I think in session 6, you and your colleague answered a question about the lack of cooperation in South Asia, in SAARC. So in Europe, I think is in becoming more inclusive. That's a very long-term goal. In other parts of the world, the trend may start to move towards direction with online technologies, but the goal is in the very, very long term. It may not even happen in the first half of this century. We have to think of the second half of this century, like a few decades from now, to think that in Asia, South, Southeast, Northeast, or in Africa or other parts of the world, there is something that could be comparable to European inclusivity.
I think probably this is not what I was probably expected in the first presentation. You talked about, I mean, I'm sorry, but you said about European inclusivity. I was talking at the global level, whether there is inequality or asymmetries in the distribution of the flow of knowledge and the flow of scholars from across the world. And I'm sorry if I was not very clear in expectation, but of course maybe we'll pick up a little bit more on European inclusivity that you talked about. But before that, maybe I can invite Bowen to reflect on what probably inclusivity means to him in international education, and also on his assessment of whether there is globally an inclusivity or a lack of it. And if you could just reflect on that. I'll come back to you, César, after this again, maybe in the next round. Yeah. Bowen?
Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and to perhaps share some of my thinkings with you. I think when we think about international education, internationalization, it has always been some kind of elite product for a very small proportion of the global population. So it has not always been very inclusive. So I agree with the first speaker on that point. And I think there are a couple of things I want to perhaps make comments on. I think the pandemic has certainly restricted the way how people can travel internationally. So in that sense, I think the kind of inclusivity in international education has certainly been decreased, because as, for instance, we as international students in this part of the world may no longer be able to access to the European or Australian higher education system because of the close of the borders and everything. But I think on the other hand, you actually see that it's not just the pandemic, but also I think there is a new wave of geopolitics emerging. The kind of big rivalries between US and China and all these kind of things. So I guess when we think about inclusivity in international education, it is really about you have to kind of looking at region specifically. So in what region, who has access, who is going to be included and excluded. And so I think I've read some of the recent research coming out in the East Asia regions that because of the pandemic and also the geopolitics. Quite a lot of students in this part of the world now tend to travel interregionally. They used to be interregionally, but now they kind of looking within this region. So that was a kind of new trend I kind of observed. So in that way, I guess the inclusivity for international education at a regional level somehow being increased. But at a more global level, you actually see it's a different kind of picture. That's something comes to my mind. I think higher education and international education always have a kind of past dependence on the political economy. So when we're looking at higher education and the mobility of students, we cannot just take this as an isolated social phenomenon. We have to always looking at the bigger international trend in terms of politics, in terms of economics. And I think normally you'd have to see that you see that the way how students flows tend to follow these kind of bigger international trends. And that's my sense.
Okay, thanks, Bowen, for this very introductory idea of what you hold when it comes to inclusivity of higher education, or particularly international education. And I now invite Fiona to make kind of an opening remark about inclusivity as she sees it, its presence or absence in the international or global international education.
Yes, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. I agree very much with a lot of the comments that have been emerging so far. And in fact, I just wanted to reflect on the overarching title of this conference, which is Reimagining Border in Cross-Border Higher Education. And a lot of my work is actually in the institutions themselves, and there are many borders within our higher education institutions, and then between our higher education institutions and society. So I would like to broaden a little bit the idea of inclusivity at this point, and actually go back to our revised definition of internationalization, together with some colleagues revised Jane Knight's definition of internationalization back in 2015 in order to encourage universities to think about learning for all and service to society as the desired goals of internationalization, and to move away from this very limited understanding of internationalization. Many universities embrace the ideas of internationalization, but there's often, I find, a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And so the idea of us revising the definition was very much to give an overarching purpose to internationalization and to encourage universities to reflect more on their own why of internationalization. And when we revised it, I just read it to you because it's a little bit long, we said that internationalization is an intentional process of integrating an international and intercultural dimension into the teaching, research, and service functions of the institution in order to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. And there were really three key messages there. And the first one was that, if you want inclusive internationalization, you have to be intentional about it, because you have to reflect about what you want from internationalization. You have to make decisions around that. And then most critically, you actually have to take action. And so while there may be many challenges in the external environment, we can control to a significant extent the internal environment of the university. And as my colleagues have just mentioned, there was a desire to make internationalization less elitist and more inclusive, saying it's not just for all students, but for all staff as well. And typically, of course, when we talk about students, the focus has always been on mobility. And we argue that it's much more about the teaching and learning process. If there is mobility, it should be integrated into the curriculum. It's only through the curriculum that you can reach all students. And when we say all staff, we mean not just all academic staff, but of course all administrative staff as well. Because if we want an inclusive internationalization, if we want it to be a part of institutional life, then we have to involve both academics and administrative staff. It has to be embedded if it's going to be successful. So what we found, as I said, there's a lot of rhetoric around this, but less reality. And especially when it comes to thinking about service to society. I mean, many institutions connect internationalization to teaching and learning and to research, but there's still, until now, not been a very strong link between internationalization and service to society. If we're serving society, they too should be included in our international efforts. And I think I would also just pick up on some of the other comments that have come here too. We have, to a large extent, focused very much on global engagement over the last years, and very often we've forgotten that local agenda. And that is, in a sense, coming back to bite us in a way, especially in the current climate, where there are many political agendas around the world today that do not necessarily see internationalization as being to the benefit of all society. And so as that landscape changes, it's really important for us, I think, to develop clear values that we associate with internationalization, and inclusivity, of course, should be one of these. And so, you know, that idea of that revised definition was really to give institutions an opportunity to think about how do we include everyone in internationalization. But as the theme of this session says, we're going towards inclusivity, and it's a long road ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for bringing in the definition that has been worked out again by you and your team there. And so just as we were preparing for this conference, we also had quite a few brainstorming sessions within Manipal here with some of the scholars who are working in the field. And then we realized why we decided to use the term cross-border than international was something very interesting and very Indian, I should say, because there's so much diversity within India. There is systemic diversity. We have the public, private, deemed, and several other universities. Central, even within public, we have central and state universities. There's so much diversity that it's so difficult for students to travel between these universities. So there are so many borders that are existing. There are so many problems, there are barriers that exist in the mobility of students from within the country. And also, even when it comes to, we also thought of avoiding, why should it be only international? Why cannot it be? So in fact, we are thinking in terms of a civilizational connect between different regions of the world, and nation as a contested concept itself. So we decided to keep it out for time being, and decided to go for cross-border education. I know definitionally there are a little more challenges when somebody generally, it's the transnational education which is associated with cross-border education, and cross-border education definitionally seen as a subset of international education. Being aware of all this definitional challenges, we decided to go with cross-border because we wanted to see if there is, even within India, if there is any possibility of making the mobility of the student possible, because it's quite a huge country, diverse systemically, also in terms of cultures. So at this point, I invite my colleague, Dr. Vijay Khare from Pune University. Dr. Khare, if you would like to make your first introductory remarks on this.
Thank you very much, Professor Neeta Inamdar, and thanking you for giving opportunity to attend 2 sessions yesterday and today. Let me give when we talked about cross-border education, India is a classic example, or it is a source for cross-border education. If we start Nalanda and Takshashila, the kind of cross-border education had during that time, thousands of years back. In a modern days, after the First World War, geopolitics, geoeconomics, and global politics shifted, and there were few institutes came in existence, and there were a number of programs started, particularly Fulbright Fellowship, then the DAD, and then other programs started by different Western world, and they pick up the student as an ambassador to disseminate and use the soft policy for spreading or disseminating the idea of their foreign policy as one of the tool. And that was the reason during this Cold War period, you can see that cross-border education was the only important tool where number of actors involved in that. But in a modern time, and particularly in a post-COVID, geopolitics and geoeconomics would be completely changed. And now, in my understanding, inclusivity and sustainability, it will be completely based on discrimination pattern. Being as heading the Department of International Students, I have enrolled more than 10,500 students from 106 countries. I just got the data. And most of the students are coming from Middle East as well as in African universities. And they are getting admissions in the field of STEM branches or the scientific institution. Whereas a Western world, when we are signing MOUs with Western universities, most of the Western universities looking India in terms of the performing arts or social sciences. So this kind of internationalization and collaboration could not work to maintain global stability and peace across the globe, because when we talked about internationalization, cross-border education, look at the statistical data. In fact, the United States of America is earning more than $27 billion from Indian students, then Australia, then Ireland, then a few countries where they are earning through the internationalization. But my point, my issue is that are they really connecting to each other for maintaining the global peace and security through the internationalization? That is one question I wanted to raise on this platform. Second important issue is that when you talked about globalization or cross-border higher education or cross-border education, there is a need to interculture the things. For example, internationalization of curriculum. When we talked about our curriculum in the context of regional language, take example of China and India is having the largest population. But what about the role of the language? Means that is one component, and the international curriculum taking student abroad, research collaboration and teaching collaboration, and Erasmus and Fulbright and other program, how they are integrating and how it reaches to the common masses. That is a very important challenge. And let me tell you, the post-COVID geopolitics completely divided the community on skill-based manpower versus unskill-based manpower. And now migration would be happen only in the field of medical, in the field of health security. I will give it a statistical data that entire migration next 10 years will be happen in the field of only health and specialized skills, whereas India as well as other developing countries lacking. And then if we talk in this way, internationalization or cross-border education, then again here you will find the disparity. And in this context, it would be very difficult for India, country like India, where we have several languages, regional identity, as well as the institutions, the state government, central government, and to maintain that quality. So my submission here, while dealing with cross-border education, what we need to top to bottom approach as well as bottom to top approach, where you can easily involve all kind of society. And our education policy from beginning we are saying equity, inclusion and quality. But in terms of statistical data, look at our gross enrollment ratio. In that gross enrollment ratio, the participation of women's is very less in terms of in a scientific area, as well as the marginalized section of the society also not involved that much. So we need to develop two kind of strategy, and that strategy should come from the top, which when we talk of internationalization. So student from Pune University, which are, I said I have enrolled 106 country student, more than 10,500. But in my government, state government, 70% I have to admit the student from only 3 districts, that is the affiliated districts. And 30% student I have to take, out of that 15% student I have to take from other state in India, and 15% out of university. And hardly we can maintain the diversity. So then in that case, the student who come from first learner, second learner generation, they faces a problem. Even they get opportunity to take any scores on short-term course through this fellowship from European Union or any other. But for their parents, it would be difficult to sponsor. And for us, for university as such, we will sponsor as a student. So what I'm saying here, while dealing with the cross-border education, we need to have a top to bottom and bottom to top approach where all sections of the society which can play important role for the inclusivity and sustainability. So this is my take on first round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Khare. Particularly the kind of facts that you're bringing to table about the kind of students you are recruiting for different programs where there is also a state condition that they need to be from the 3 districts. So when we think of these realities in and around us in India, we think that probably what colleague Emma was saying earlier, Dr. Emma was saying earlier, probably comes in as a possible option when we look at virtual mobility or something that is technology based. So today, after COVID-19, one thing we realized, all of us, education had to find itself in this chaos, and it found the anchorage in technology. So this technology dependence of the new education in the pandemic times with the technology. So we are moving more towards, when it comes to international education, it does move towards virtual student mobility or virtual learning. So in that case, Dr. Prado, would you like to say how the virtual mobility, what earlier we had a long discussion about it in the previous session by Dr. Emma, would you like to say how it is going to be inclusive or not inclusive? And also, as you do that, earlier you said something about European inclusivity. If you could also reflect a little more on that, what you meant by European inclusivity, which you found is absent in other parts.
By European inclusivity, right?
Yes.
Virtual.
Right. Okay. So just to follow up on European inclusivity, I mentioned the Erasmus program as picking up speed and allowing millions of people, faculty, staff as well, and youths to cross borders in a number of ways, usually for a few months. In case of students, only for a few weeks. In the case of staff, administrative and teaching staff. But it's embedded in the societies of European Union and European countries in general. So it's going to remain, it's going to grow in inclusivity, it's going to be sustainable in the long term because there is a demand and there is supply, there is more funding going for that. So it's going to stay for the long term, and it could be a good model for other parts of the world. I focus on regions, and I'm happy that Bowen agree with added information that regional mobility is becoming more relevant than interregional or global mobility, at least some patterns of it. European inclusivity. The Bologna process is something broader than the Erasmus program. It's outside, it's more structural, it's trying to create a structure of levels and credits that is more homogeneous, and then it's added over the years a number of issues, quality, inclusivity as well, etc. But those are very complex issues that take time to advance. But the Bologna process is also going. It had its last big meeting in Rome last year, and it has a number of long-term goals for the end of the decade, for 2030. So inclusivity is one of the key goals of the Bologna process as well. Is going to pay attention, for instance, to refugees, people who are coming into Europe. Europe is the main attractor of people fleeing economic security hardships, now climate troubles. And many millions of these people don't have the way they lack education, they lack credentials, they have many problems. So the Erasmus activities, I think, I'm not very sure, but I think is going to pay attention to this issue as well. But the Bologna process is keen on that as well. The first question was more about virtual issues. I agree with what most people, I think, have been saying regarding new technologies and mobility. Is here to stay, is going to grow. There are many bottlenecks, especially in the are being resolved slowly in many places, but fastly in countries that have the technologies. And in the long term, in 10, 20 years, I think much of the world will be enjoying 4th generation, parts of the world 5 generations, and even 6th generation technology that allows very fast communication and very fast interactions. Having said that, as people from the UNESCO, Emma's Valieva mentioned, there are many people who don't like full virtual education. It has many drawbacks. People want to interact physically. They want to party together, to meet the societies, to do many things. So I think virtual support is going to grow, but it's never going to be a fully. We will not have a global university just based on virtual technologies. And perhaps Estonia or Finland could be close to that. But those are unique countries, very cold out there in the north of Europe. But most of the world is not. It's not for that. Just remember the MOOCs, the massive online open courses. They were booming 10, 15 years ago. Millions of people sign up, but most of the people didn't continue very much. Very few people pay up for degrees, and they are not very well recognized. They are an excellent tool, especially for people who don't have other means to learn about a particular subject. So niche, the niche of MOOCs is wonderful, is welcome. There are going to be more niches for short-term courses, for specialized interactions, not only at the university level, but at any stage of education. Now we are moving towards lifelong learning. Companies need to refresh knowledge among their staff, provide new knowledge. People want to move from one company to another, so that they need to recycle knowledge and to get the new insights and new ideas. So virtual support will play a role, but I think people will demand more blended interaction, sometimes physical, often physical more and more as the pandemic recedes, and virtual quite often in many unexpected ways, one-to-one, small groups, massive offline courses. I think the virtual, the supply of virtual education will evolve very quickly with many new types of niche offers. So I cannot predict in which way, but I think it's going to change very quickly.
Okay, thank you. Fiona, if I can ask you a very similar question. I mean, I think you did speak about how it has been elitist and international education has not reached every part of the world with equal access. So do you think moving more towards a virtual space, will the cross-border education or international education that you call is going to change in the virtual education era? Or will the digital divide continue to haunt and continue to make it accessible only to the digital haves and leave out the digital have-nots? So is that, how do you see the future coming in for international education there?
Okay, thank you again. I think this has been discussed. I heard people talking about this in the previous session. And of course, there's always the issue of access. How do you overcome it? There's the issue of access to physical mobility, but also the issue of access to virtual learning. And these problems will be bigger in some parts of the world, in some communities more than others. And that is something, again, that governments will have to grapple with, and again, at the institutional level. Okay, when I was thinking about this topic, I'm no expert on digital learning. I have been a student of digital learning. I have been forced onto digital teaching in the last year and a half and learned from it. As it turned out, I was actually taking a postgraduate certificate online when the pandemic broke out. And I was able to experience at a very personal level what it's like to sign up for a program that has been designed for quality learning entirely online, compared to us all panicking and desperately trying to get our classes online. Okay, so I would say a key message here for me is, virtual is not second class to the real thing. You can have very poor in-person teaching and learning, and you can have excellent online teaching and learning. So I think what we will see in the future is, as César said, a blended approach. I don't think it would make sense for any university worth its salt today to say, I'm going back to what I did before. That would not make any sense in the world we live in today. It's about how do you embrace technology and how can you be inclusive about it? As César suggested, is it about identifying niches? Is it about finding, professional training programs, learning for people who can't normally access university, and ensuring that on a continuum, students may have access to 100% online or 100% in person, or a mixture of the two? And what would be the best? What would be the better alternative in the different circumstances? I don't think there's any of us here today who've been working in international higher education who would simply hop on a plane and go somewhere without thinking, could I actually do this better online? Would that be a better use of my time? Would it be kinder to the planet? Would it be making better use of resources? So I don't think there's any of us here who are not going to have that conversation with ourselves and with our colleagues. We want to meet, we want to do something. What would be the better way to do it? What would be the most effective way to do that? And quite frankly, I think I've been to more conferences in the last year and a half online than I would ever be, able to travel to. Now, there are different experiences. We know that. I just brought my students back into the classroom 2 weeks ago, and everybody said, yes, online was wonderful, but being back in the classroom is so much better. So there's been an appreciation, I think, as well, of the value of human beings coming together. I think we understand that more now and we appreciate it more. But I think we can also see that it's not sustainable to imagine a world in which we are all constantly zotting around the planet, going to meetings and conferences. But at the same time, I don't think we should shame physical mobility and suggest that it's necessarily a bad thing either. It's going to be a struggle. It's about finding balance and finding sustainable ways forward that are inclusive, but are respectful not just of an individual's needs or an institutional needs, but of the planet that we all share.
I'll come to that a little later about the carbon footprints. But before that, I was looking at how the entire field has become more, entire higher education become more marketized. This marketization of higher education, is it more so when the technology enters education is the next question. So maybe I can invite Bowen if you would like to speak about it, because I see most of these companies, I'll give you some context to this as to, if you look at, somebody just spoke about MOOC, okay, massive open online courses. Somebody also spoke about a collaborative online international learning, CHEI. So we have been talking about this, but when it comes to MOOC, then it becomes more like an edutech companies, making it more of an industry. And if you look for very basic information, some of these companies, in fact, Udemy says on its very website, is an online learning teaching marketplace with over 155,000 courses and 40 million students and teachers. So on the website itself, it says it's one of the leading leaders in the marketplace. And not only that, I mean, if I also had an interaction with a young scholar who actually went ahead to find out some of them, which are the leading ones in this field. And we found the top edutech companies. If you take a list of top edutech companies, 50 of them, Udacity, Coursera, Instructure, GoGuardian, Duolingo, Masterclass, Kahoot, some of them to name. There are around 50, if you take around the top 50 edutech companies, 40 of them are from the US. Another 8 to 10 are from some parts of Europe, and the rest, 1 or 2 probably will appear from the rest of the world. So in this marketplace as well, we see quite some inequality or asymmetry that we have been talking about. And maybe I invite Bowen, if you would like to reflect on this, or anybody else. I mean, I think let's open it up instead of asking each one. And whoever wants to speak about this can speak. Bowen, would you like to go?
Yeah, yes. So I think you kind of talk about this issue of marketization of higher education. I think it's been going on for a long time, especially in Anglophone countries. In places like UK, Australia, you can see, the marketization of higher education become even, that is being even accelerated because of the pandemic. And I think there has been some kind of student protest in London because they pay a lot of money and then essentially they were locked in small rooms without real access to classroom and all that. So that has been a controversial issue. I think from my own perspective, I can see that, when people looking at internationalization, they talk about internationalization, they actually, they talk about different things. Now, it seems like we're kind of referring to the same thing, but the motivations that drives internationalization is fundamentally different. In many of the Western countries, higher education is essentially a big business. So that is, $1 million industry, okay, that generates jobs, generates revenue, income, and so on. Now, for developing countries, that's something different. So there is a distinction between that. And when you kind of marketalize your higher education sector and who is included and who is not included, certainly become a very important issue. I think the previous speaker also talked about the European higher education area, the European higher education space. Now, because I'm studying in the UK, so if we think about the effects of Brexit, then certainly, because of that, the European students no longer eligible as home fee paying students. Now they have to pay international fees. And what we see is there is a significant drop in the number of EU applicants to the UK universities. So that's the kind of effects that we can see around markets and higher education. And I think, we're kind of increasingly seeing there are big companies get involved into the higher education sector, venture capitals, and these are for profit making companies and so on. But I think essentially, when people looking at internationalization, you have to also remember that we're living in an equal world, a world that is characterized by the word system. There is a word system theory. So fundamentally, the knowledge kind of flew from the periphery to the center, and I think that is the fundamental problem. And the same with capital. So I just really don't really see that. How can we actually make sure that internationalization can be truly equal and inclusive, and it was made available to everybody, because essentially it was the structure that we have made it only available to some of the elites. And also the way how we internationalize our system tend to be the Western kind of Westernization equals to internationalization. And also the curriculum, if we think about curriculum, whose language and whose curriculum, whose knowledge and what knowledge accounts, what knowledge has been legitimated, and all these things matters.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Bowen, for bringing in that about whose language and whose knowledge is legitimate, and this idea of please go ahead. Yeah.
I was just saying, even not just about language and curriculum, but also the way the direction of flow of students. And I think people talk about the flow of international students, Indian, Chinese students often go to the West, and why not they go to African countries and other developing countries? And that's quite evident in these kind of things. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is exactly where we started our conference preparations too, because we also see this kind of not only the flow of students, but also the flow of knowledge. When you say the globalization, whose global is this? That's a question that generally troubles, I think. And when you say globalization, is it generally, mostly we are talking about the westernization, than whose global is, who's mainstream, who is on the fringes or the margins. That is what decides most of the things. And now coming to Professor Khare, would you like to comment on whether this technology divide is going to impact the cross-border education of the future as well, just as much as it has been? How divided it has been so far? Is it going to be the same thing in future?
Thank you very much. From centuries, education is divided. It's a reality. We need to understand that scene. Second, important when we talk about digital market and digital education. Basically, in the Indian context, already the government of India has launched a number of new mechanisms for Indian institutions, where 40% courses we can hire. We can go to the MOOCs or any SWAYAM platform. But what I'm saying here, we need to new reforms in each particularly developing countries, that when we talk about right to education, right to food, time has come now. Our educators or the institutional builders must talk about right to internet, because if you provide internet to everyone, then we can change the mindset of the people, how they are afraid about the technology. So this is a main important challenge for global educator, number one. Then in the marketization of education, basically when education become as an industry under the GATT norms, and then later on in World Trade Organization in 1995 onwards, that becomes a source of, first kind of source for education as a industry. And then later entire policies has been changing. And when you talked about the marketization of education, what I feel myself, even when we talked about different institution now coming to India, are they really giving us first kind of knowledge to developing country? Take example of Oxford or any leading university in the world. Are they ready to give it first knowledge to the third world countries? And that is a real question. Even in our online education, I don't think knowledge will be shared, knowledge shared, or the flow of the knowledge will be as it is what in a reality. And that is the real question for us, how we can come out from this process of marketization by education as well as the virtual reality. So this is my take on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So just before I go ahead, I would like to announce that the participants, the attendees and other panelists, if they have any questions, they can start putting it in the Q&A section, and we will take it up after another round of discussions. And the next one I would like to go ahead is with, if Fiona, if I can invite you to, you just started earlier, you talked about the planetary, about the kind of impact, the sustainability of international education, particularly the planetary emergency or the global climate emergency that we are all faced with. It has actually come to question the international education also to an extent. In fact, in one of the studies by Robin Schild, he studies the mobility and what impact it has on the global climate change. And they say the emissions from travels and changes in consumption that happens with the mobility of the students, it has an impact on carbon footprint. And the estimate is that there is a 14 megatons of carbon dioxide per year, which is associated with student mobility. It may sound very unusual for discussions to begin with that, but we also have Professor Christiana Trua, who is a professor from University of Bremen. Maybe I'll invite her at the end to also reflect on this. She is into sustainability research. So emissions from travels and changes in consumption leading to 14 megatons of carbon dioxide per year, which is associated with student mobility. So especially in an era when we need to, so when United Nations says we need to reset our relationship with nature, how do you see or where do you see the international education going in the future? Fiona.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, in our definition of internationalization, internationalization does not equal mobility. Mobility is a part of internationalization, but if we truly want internationalization to be an inclusive experience, then that means global learning for all. And I think many of the speakers today have picked up on different ways through partnership agreements for knowledge sharing, through internationalization of the curriculum, through different ways in which we can genuinely offer an international experience to our students and our staff. Mobility is one small part of that. And what percentage that should be, how we can reduce our impact on the planet, I am no expert on that. But I think as long as we keep thinking international equals mobility, we'll never begin to address the issue. I think if we begin to think more creatively, more inclusively, more sustainably about internationalization, we see it as providing an international student experience throughout the time that our students are with us in our institutions. And that international experience is not only in the classroom, it is an on-campus experience. It is engaging with the many international, intercultural opportunities that we have in the local societies where our universities are based, where we're giving our students and our staff the opportunities to engage locally, to bring international knowledge, as Vijay was suggesting, the best of our research knowledge, bringing it into our communities, what we have learned through our international partners and sharing that with our societies, embedding higher education in our local communities. So taking the local to the global and the global to the local. And there are multiple ways of doing that. Mobility sits within that, it's a part of it, but we must move away from thinking that international is necessarily mobility. There are so many other ways of doing this.
Yeah, fair enough. Because of course, mobility is one of the things that you do in internationalization, but many of the collaborative efforts, whether it's collaborative research or or even the internationalization of curriculum, somewhere they have some association with some mobilities of scholars somewhere, and they begin there, and that's some kind of an information. I'll tell you, I mean, if only some of us, those, I think we have had 40 speakers in this conference, and had we all met in Manipal and had this kind of a discussion, probably a few, at least 20 collaborations would have emerged in terms of research or something at the end of the meeting. I bet this, because we have had several such conferences early, and they do lead, they have kind of a cascading effect when the interactions continue, when personally people meet with each other. But if we take out the mobility part out of international education, then what is left probably will need some kind of a life support, is my very personal view. Because everything depends, at least one travel, maybe that will lead to some kind of a collaborative. So if you and I have to work together on a research paper, at least one physical meeting probably, and some interaction that's much big, just beyond an online interaction, where we walk down on a beach. If you had come, I would have taken you for sure. Probably that's where we would have thought of a joint paper or a research project, for which we would have found maybe some funding and maybe something else. So a lot happens when people meet, interact, travel. And if we take out that part of international education, what remains, I'm not very sure personally.
No, I'm not suggesting you remove it. I'm suggesting you think much more broadly around what internationalization is and how you can use your limited resources with an institution to give everybody every student an international dimension. So a part of that would be mobility, but to put all your resources into mobility and then affect only a very, very small percentage of students and staff is perhaps not necessarily the best way of using those resources. Perhaps part of those resources can actually be used to create much more impact on a bigger part of the population.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And anybody who would like to comment on sustainability part as to what impact will it have on the future of international education, or whether the kind of pressure on environment that entire thing is creating, if we leave that behind, what would happen if we completely move into the virtual mobility? Will it be a little different future that waits for international education? Anybody who would like to comment, you're welcome. And then we will start taking questions. Maybe I see some of them coming in.
Can I?
Yeah, please, Dr. Khare. And then
sustainability would be depends on 4 factors. It's not only student mobility, staff mobility, collaborative publication, joint collaborative research. Then important thing is joint collaborative fundings. If you any institution would like to play important role for internationalization, what we need to have a joint collaborative research project, joint collaborative publication, joint collaborative workshop, joint collaborative funding, and then student mobility. Student mobility would be one important key factor, but the faculty and institution collaboration, that depends the future of internationalization and which way we are moving, that will give it the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Emma, would you like to come in for a minute? And maybe because I see a comment from your side, would you like to speak here for a minute about, yeah, please. Yeah.
Would you like me to follow up on the kind of comment that's going on in the chat? I'm not sure whether everybody can see that.
Yeah,
but there was an interesting question. I think, Panjali, I don't know if it was from you or if you put it forward, but you know, picking up on this idea that there's a sort of status difference between virtual forms of mobility. I mean, you know, to build on what Fiona was saying, we could think about it not strictly as mobility, but interaction, right? Virtual interactions compared to physical interactions. And, you know, now I'm thinking about walking on a beach and coming up with ideas there. So, you know, of course, they're different. And I think, you know, if I go back to the research that I was presenting before, which looks at virtual student mobility, we know that there's no baseline. There's no, you know, easy way for us to assess the state of this around the world. We know that there are pockets of expertise. We know that there are pockets of interest. We know that there's probably more happening than we've been able to map. At the same time, because this is still a very new phenomenon for a lot of people, and we could apply this to the, you know, virtual teaching and learning without the international dimension as well, I think. I would suggest that, you know, until such time as more people have had an opportunity to experience the possibility of what can be achieved in the virtual format, there will remain this kind of mindset, you know, something that holds people back, something that makes them think that perhaps this is a less good way of interacting or building community. And I think I would say in response to that it's different for sure, you know, and I agree we can have a certain level of interaction. Let's just take the example of a conference like this one, you know, and in some ways I think you've been able to bring more people together for this than you might have done had it been in Manipal, you know, as beautiful as your beaches may be. But there are other issues that, you know, go beyond the kind of physical environment, right? At the same time, what we can achieve together and the interactions that we can have, and those, you know, those longed for sort of hallway moments, as I think about them, you know, in conferences or in lecture halls or that kind of thing, those are very difficult to replicate. So I think rather than thinking about a kind of replication model, you know, well, if we do something in a virtual environment, it should be the same as we might do physically. We have to think about them as different modalities and work out how can we best engage people, because that's really what we're about in higher education. It's about engaging people. It's about engaging students. It's about engaging our teachers. It's about engaging the communities that are around us. How can we best do that given the options that are available to us?
Yeah, I think thank you very much, Emma, for this. And also, of course, as you said, there are economic implications, there are also environment implications, and that's where probably the virtual mobility comes into place, and the virtual meeting places like this, where we are able to discuss, deliberate, and share a lot of our views and have exchange of knowledge, possibly without a major economic or an environmental impact. So it does make sense to that extent, definitely. But yeah, so there's always this trade-off between the cultural learning and probably that would have cultural learning and other things, of course, that we discussed then, and when it comes to environmental and economic impact or financial impact, to be more specific, of this kind of an exchange. Thank you very much, Emma. Anybody else who would like to speak? Just now kind of it's open for discussions. Others can ask questions, comment, discuss it further. Professor Christiana Truva, would you like to make an intervention at this point?
Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, I had to switch off again because I had a phone call. Yeah, I'm listening with very high interest, particularly as the course director of our Master in European Studies in Bremen. And I'm thinking about how we make our Master in European Studies more inclusive. So traditionally, we've been a face-to-face teaching institution, and we have been forced to very quickly adapt to the pandemic because our students couldn't travel at all. They don't get visa to Germany. And in the end, it was for 3 semesters now that our university has been closed. So there will be a very careful opening now. It's not as if we are returning to normal yet. So there will still be quite a lot of online teaching. And I regard that as partly a challenge, partly also as an advantage, because it allows us to bring in experts, for instance, for teaching, who we would otherwise find difficult to get to our students. At the same time, we still have the situation that students struggle with traveling to Bremen. So I'm starting MES this year on Monday. And so far, there are only 2 students present in Bremen. The others are still waiting for their visa. They're still quarantining, whatever. I also have a student who has small children coming from another European state outside the European Union. And she says she cannot really afford coming to Germany for a whole year. It's difficult with small children. It's difficult because of the living expenses, because Germany is relatively expensive. So I think that online teaching also offers quite a lot of chances. I'm still not sure whether it will be possible to blend the two, whether I can have students on site full time and others just joining with sort of streaming and hybrid systems. That is what we are going to try out in the oncoming semester. But my hope is that this would actually allow us to be a lot more inclusive, to merge the advantages of face-to-face, of being together, of forming an international group in the same classroom, with still allowing people who cannot be there for whatever reasons to still be part of the whole. May not be a perfect part, maybe sort of, well, will not be quite as close a community of students if people cannot actually travel to Bremen, cannot sit in the classroom with others, but it's still better than nothing to participate online. So I think hybrid may actually be the way to go, and we will have to adapt our teaching concepts. How do we explain things best online? How do we explain things to a group which is there in person, and to make them interact with students who come to the group online? That will be a real challenge, and I think we're still in the beginning of trying out how to do this. And so I think you are actually much further advanced than we are in terms of looking at how do we make this happen. So I'm just hoping that the oncoming year will allow us to form such an half online, half face-to-face group, that we will still manage to make the students into an international group, to allow them to enlarge their professional networks and still keep going.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Thank you, Christian.
thank you very much.
Yeah, so hybrid is the future. You know, this is where we are heading because we'll have to have a combination of in-person and virtual modes, whether it is teaching within or it is international. Fiona, I think you would like to say something.
I would just like to come and say hybrid is hard. I don't know how many people here in the room have tried it, but trying to manage a physical classroom face-to-face and other students on screen, I did it for 1 week and I was exhausted at the end of it. And even the students say, either we're in the classroom or we're online. Trying to combine the two is really, really hard. I mean, Emma's maybe more of an expert than I am here, but I don't really think we have the technology yet to make hybrid work. Blended, yes. Something in the classroom, something online. But hybrid, trying to bring these two groups together in one space. I think if you're only one teacher in the classroom, it's very hard. Maybe with two teachers in the classroom, it's possible. That's just my personal experience.
Thank you, and I agree with you, Fiona. We had to experiment with this hybrid mode last time, compelled by the rules that were changing locally by the government here, and so some students were given this option to come in or not to come in. So some students who wanted to be away from their families, run away from their families and come to campus, they came to campus. And then there were some students who thought it was less expensive for them to stay at home and do it. They stayed at home. So again, as Emma earlier said, some of them are carers, some of them are also part-time working. And for them, the online version worked better than the physical. And of course, we had very similar. Initially, it was very, very exhaustive for us to get used to this hybrid mode. But then over a period of time, I think we got used to it, not really fully used to, but then I think we are able to cope with it in a different, we have to find our own coping mechanisms to deal with the hybrid mode. Okay, so that's alongside, so then if not hybrid, then what Fiona just said about a dual mode, I mean, where some part of the course is offered online, some in person. So which one, so these are all the new things that are emerging. So we as educationists, those who have been academics, we have been discussing about possible option, solution, all exploring it by ourselves. But how are the policymakers going to come in and say, maybe we will have to focus on this or that? And what kind of policy interventions that we require for the future if it has to be more inclusive and sustainable? Maybe this is more like a last round of interventions that I ask you to make, where how you would see making, what kind of policy interventions do you see as possible at this stage when we ourselves are facing these many confusions, dual mode or hybrid mode, or so many other options that we are just exploring? It's so very fluid. With this fluidity, can policymakers have some kind of a direction that can help? And so after this one quick round, I think I'll take a few questions also. Anybody who would like to go with this? Any policy directions? Yes, César. César,
yeah,
and then
maybe on this, since I come from an international relations background, I wanted to mention at some point, and I think this is the best time, that international relations people, academics, think tank experts, government officials, often engage in scenario planning, in visualizing different futures, in visualizing the main trends, mega trends, sometimes it's called, the clear directions, and then trying to see possible diversions from those mega trends, adding a number of other factors. And then people with greater vision, they even added the most the least probable factors that could create a big change. These are the black swans, etc. Maybe you've heard about these. So I think Dr. Khare can perhaps contribute on this front because he's an international relations expert, and perhaps in his interactions with governments, there's been a number of exercises on that. I think those kinds of exercises should be brought to universities. Universities now have to realize clearly, I think most universities realize that they are important actors in global, regional, cross-border movements, fluidity, interactions, but they don't know how to navigate with them. So they need some tools, and maybe these scenario exercises can be a relevant tool. So my suggestion for policymakers at the university level is to engage with policymakers outside universities, at the government, in government agencies, and bring in other elements, other actors around, within and around the universities that can play a role. The students, maybe, advanced students, staff, donors, local community leaders, etc., to plan first to vision possible futures, and then to plan given a number of scenarios. I don't know whether this has been done in any way in India or in any other university around the world, but I think this has to be done because it's been done at the government level, it is done at the business level, and universities now cannot remain aloof, cannot remain in the ivory towers much longer, given so many factors. So virtual communication is now the main one we're talking about, but energy factors, climate factors are coming in. Europe is now suffering an energy crisis, and this is stopping the economy. This might stop some economies in the next few months. So we have to incorporate many factors that we thought would only affect societies and institutions slowly in the very long term.
Yeah, thank you. Emma, you wanted to say something, did you?
Yeah, if I can. I could offer 3 sort of policy-driven suggestions, and they go micro, meso, macro. I think, from a micro level, and here I'm thinking about government policymakers. And again, it's going to vary by system. In some systems, you have more public institutions, in some you have more private. So the extent to which government has direct control over what higher education institutions can do obviously varies. But I think on a more micro level, what we've seen, if we want to facilitate more virtual mobility, is there needs to be some facilitation of the regulatory aspects. I mentioned in the presentation that some of our institutions have struggled even to get a virtual course accepted as part of a credit-bearing part of a student's program. So those feel to me like, I wouldn't say they're small administrative issues if you're having to deal with them. They certainly don't feel small, but they're things which, in the suite of, where governments do regulate what can count as part of a program, that is a fairly straightforward reform to make. In the suite of things. The kind of meso level one I would relate to digital infrastructure. I'm based at UNESCO, so I'm very conscious of what the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of gearing us towards. And we know that, for example, the UN has a roadmap for digital cooperation, which looks to try and achieve universal connectivity by 2030. Again, as with some of the other SDGs, that may feel ambitious, but it is certainly an ambition that we should be advocating for policymakers to work towards. And that is something which, identifying as a major challenge to get people online. I mean, getting them online is one thing, and then, being online and knowing how to interact online is another. But let's start with that first point and advocate for that as a policy measure. And then the sort of more macro point, perhaps, is this broader idea about, let's say, mindset. How do we assess, how do we value virtual engagement? How do we value virtual teaching and learning? How do we value virtual mobility? And that, when we found at institutional level that if you have a sort of a VSM champion, if you have people who are on board, that then, it particularly helps if your leadership is on board. And again, from a government perspective, that's an area where they can use their sort of influencing mechanisms to support this broader shift that I think is necessary as we move to a world where virtual and physical forms of interaction become more commonplace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for staying back for this particular panel, because we have been taking up quite some work on global citizenship education. And if that has to be achieved, the SDG 4.7, on which some PhD research work is going on here, and which, of course, necessitates some kind of an internationalization for GCED to be achieved, global citizenship education. As Fiona said, not necessarily mobility, but some kind of an internationalization of curriculum or internationalization at home, and how this accessibility is given to many, many more people in the coming times. And your suggestions at micro, meso, and macro level that you suggest of facilitation and small regulation changes that can accommodate credits on online or in several other things. I know when we call, maybe if you can call it academic nimbleness, that kind of that academic nimbleness that facilitates this kind of acceptance of credits. So that can be at the micro level, at the meso level. You talked about digital infrastructure. I'm sorry I'm repeating, but because there are quite a few of my students also joining here, I suggest they make note of this. And also macro, which is more about the mindset that you talked about. Thank you very much for that intervention. It made a lot of sense. And I think this one, I think Stefano has a question, and I will invite the panel to answer. Stefano, would you like to go and ask it? Stefano? I think he has left a question here. No, oh, he's cooking. Okay, all right. Okay, he has left a question here sorry, okay, I'll read it here. What will be the sociological and psychological impact of virtual teaching or mobility? There is not the danger to favor the increase of atomism in the society, is this question. Would somebody like to answer that? Professor Khare?
Yes, this is a very important book has come on emotional intelligence, and that book says that you on screen, you cannot focus more than 9 minutes. And if more than 9 minutes, if you sit in front of screen, that would have, that has number of repercussions in your body. So this is a new phase where the entire world is going to face it then. But after 10 years, the issue of online and blended mode education will be completely different. We need more psychologists to train the student as well as the teacher, and that book says that it would be a real challenge for the global society. So what he has asked the question, what really challenge, particularly in a human body, that we need to understand that one in that context also. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Bowen has something to say, and then I'll come to Fiona. Bowen hasn't spoken for a while.
Oh yes, I'm just going to say that the psychological impact of the virtual learning, I think, yeah, also the sociological impact. I think, like if we think about internationalization, it's not just about learning a subject or content knowledge. There's so much more to it. I mean, you have to recognize the added value of international education, the kind of opportunities to build your network, to gain, to increase your kind of social cultural capital while studying in a different country, and all these things are part of the package. And now, if we just do everything online, then you kind of remove all these really valuable things. People learn not just by themselves, but through social interaction. But if you're just staring in front of a computer in your room, then a lot of these kinds of elements are just gone. So I think if we think about sustainable higher education, international higher education development, we have to gradually put these things back if the circumstances allows. But of course, I mean, because of the micro environment, some of the things are not doable. But I think in the long term, it has to go back to the physical format. That's my thinking.
Okay, great. Also, if diversity has to be a part of this, then definitely diversity and cultural learning remains at the heart of it. Maybe I think we need to expect that this is going to be back again. Fiona, now you wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize for the light here, but I've got low winter sun coming in and the shutters are on the outside, so there's nothing I can do about it just now. But just a general reflection. I wanted to go back to a point I made earlier on. You know, you can have good and bad teaching and learning in any space, whether it's in the classroom or online. And I think, you know, for a lot of us, our experience of online is about us as teachers. Teaching online without knowing how to do it, having received no training, having very limited technology. I know many colleagues that never heard of Zoom when they had to work out a way to get onto the platform and start teaching their classes, okay? So I actually think there's a huge opportunity to improve classroom teaching through positive experiences of online teaching and learning. And I'd like to focus, it's not about online teaching, it's about online learning and about identifying the ways to learn online. And there are many options online that can complement the classroom or can stand alone. There are many ways to get students to interact online they're much more effective than what you can do with a classroom full of students. You know, Vijay mentioned, you know, the attention span online is about 10 minutes. That's why most good recordings in an online space are under 10 minutes. Our attention span in the classroom isn't much longer, and yet we still subject students to hours of listening in lectures. And there is a piece here about, you know, I would actually argue the lecture hall is dead. I think we've come to a point in time when if we want students to absorb transmission of knowledge, that can happen online. When the student can do it in their own time, at their own pace, they can sit with others and do it. They can listen they can slow the speed of the transmission down, they can increase it, they can do it in their way. And that the value of the contact with the teacher is in smaller groups. And this is what I mean by a more blended approach. And there's so much to learn from good online learning that can really revolutionize the way we do our classroom teaching.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you very much. I think my colleague Pranjali has a question. Pranjali, would you like to go ahead and ask this question to the panelists yourself?
Sorry, I was on mute. Anyone can address this probably, that there was this one question, to what extent is teacher training an essential part of virtual student mobility?
I think there's a consensus that we need it. Everybody, almost all of us who are here, we are all looking for some kind of a training, probably. Fiona, would you like to speak about it?
Well, I think that's one of the problems of why so many students felt their online experience was such a terrible one, and why many of the teachers themselves suffered as well, because they were making it up as they went along. Like anything, to do it well, you need professional development. And so absolutely, if you're going to be organizing learning in an online space or an online collaborative space or an online international collaborative space, then of course, you know, that implies the appropriate professional development as in everything we do.
Exactly. So maybe Emma will note that as another thing, that the policy interventions can also come into picture when it comes to providing training to teachers in preparing them for the digital world. Maybe also one of the policy pointers that emerge at the end of the discussion. So it's just now everybody has been saying that the attention span is not more than 10-15 minutes. And here we are, we have taken around 1.5 hours in this discussion, but I must say this has been very, very engaging with all of you seeing such very interesting, coming out with such interesting ideas. And I think, but it's time that we need to bring this discussion to an end. It has been very exciting. So, some very interesting insights coming from a definition that started with Fiona all the way to going to policies. Everything very well taken, very interesting ideas. And I think we'll again go through what we have discussed again, because I'm completely listening to very intently. Sometimes it happens that you miss out on some interesting points here and there. So thank you very much for joining in for this panel. It meant a lot that you agreed to be on this panel. César, Fiona, Bowen, Vijay, Emma, and Christiana. So it was surprising that you stayed back and joined only to make it more interesting, and it meant a lot. Thanks for joining us for this. And would you like to make if somebody wants to say one final comment, here is your chance. Anybody who wants to make one final comment?
Just to thank you for moderating our conversation. It was really nice meeting you all virtually.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of the two-day conference. We have had quite some interesting sessions, quite a few papers. We're also bringing out an edited volume book, hopefully early next year, if even possible, which looks unlikely with the kind of challenges we're facing. Maybe early next year, by January or February latest, we will be able to bring out an edited volume book out of the papers, because we have had 24 papers for this conference, and even if we take around 20 of them, which are the best, and then maybe we'll have interesting edited volume coming out on this. So thank you everyone, and because we are closing the conference, I would also like to thank all the chairs in all these panels, and also all the presenters, all 24 presenters, 24 papers, but there are 30 or more, 40 people who participated as resource persons in the conference, all panel members, this panel and other panels as well that we have had, and my young team that includes Richa, Justin, Jyoti, Mahesh, Pranjali, Priya, Yatharth, Meet and my PhD students, Medini, Sushmita, Atmika, and the Department of Philosophy, Languages and MEP. A lot of people came together in organizing this event. It looks to 2 days of being hooked to our systems, but a lot of work has gone beyond behind that. And I thank each one of them for coming together for making this a success. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice Friday evening, all of you, and a happy weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.